Hey everyone, welcome to Life After Work. This is Solomon. Sorry I've been a little bit late getting this video out. I promised it a week or so ago. I kept trying, finally got past the technical problems, and then I wondered if I should even bother. But I decided to go ahead and start with it. As you can see from the description below, I'm calling this video H2. Now, it's not the story about the second generation of Hummers, it's not about hydrogen. H2 is what I'm calling horrible history. Now, I'm going to begin my history, my horrible history, 106 years ago. And that's because everyone I grew up with was around back then. Uh, my great grandmother, my grandparents, my great grandfather, all my greats on both sides of the family, my grandparents were young, but they were there then. And then the history goes forward. My father and mother, all of our parents, uh, my brother and I, my generation, and our children and grandchildren. Now, this is basically going to be history about everybody's history, not just my history and not just the history of the United States. It pretty much covers everyone, and I consider it horrible history. So let's go back 106 years. 106 years, that takes us to 1914. So what's the significance of that? Well, my grandfather was 18, and his parents, my great great grandparents, uh, sent him off to war, World War One. Well, it wasn't called World War One. It was called the Great War, the war to end all wars. It was terrible. Everything I've ever seen, heard, anecdotally from the family or in school shows that it was a terrible, horrible war. It tore Europe up. Fields that had grown crops were now filled with trenches and barbed wire, and bombs were blowing them up. It was just a terrible time. And it did include just about everybody in the world. America was there, Canada was there, of course, England, Australia, New Zealand, everybody was there, and all Europeans. It was right there in their front yard. So many of you subscribers, you've got your stories of that time too, because I'm sure your parents and great grandparents told you about it. Well, my grandfather was over there, and he got gassed with mustard gas. It affected his lungs. It pretty much lasted the rest of his life, which was shortened somewhat by that. But it lasted for 4 years, and at the end of it, there were 40 million people dead on all sides, civilians, military, from all countries. 40 million people gone. So now everybody was coming home. They were going back to their homes. The people in Europe were going out to repair their fields, to get themselves back active again, get their lives normalized. But then the next piece of horrible history started, because in 1918, it was 6 years later, in 1918, um, the Spanish flu pandemic began. Well, that makes sense because at the end of 1918, all these soldiers came home. Our grandparents came home to all different states, all different countries, and people in Europe went home to all their different countries if they had been displaced. And even though it's called the Spanish influenza, I remember taking history classes talking about the pandemic. Now, I heard about it from my family. Everybody had stories of losing someone in the big flu, the influenza epidemic. That's what they called it. It was a pandemic, though. And then when I got into school and I studied it in history, I thought, oh, yeah, I know all about that. We lost a lot of family there. Well, that was long before I was born, but it was when you're growing up with great grandparents and grandparents who are telling you this stuff, you kind of feel like it's part of your history. And to some degree it is. But at any rate, here we are, all these people coming home, And naturally, not knowing that it was a pandemic, not knowing much about what they were dealing with in those days, uh, they spread it all over the world and it spread quickly. It came to the United States, and I remember seeing pictures of barracks full of soldiers in the U.S. Uh, suffering from influenza. And I believe I read in some of my studies in school that the first outbreak in the U.S. was at an army base. Well, Canada had it, the United States had it, everybody that sent people home had it. Well, that lasted until 1920, and there was 50 million people that died from that. 2 years, 50 million. Uh, that was pretty hard to take. Uh, but the pandemic was over, the war was over, there had been years of misery and suffering and loss, and people were ready to go about their daily lives and try to get themselves back on track. And they did. Well, that lasted till from 1920. And by the way, my grandfather came home. He didn't have the influenza. He was a farmer, so he went back to the farm, kind of automatically isolated from most of the problems. So he didn't bump into it. Well, my grandmother got pregnant. So for the last uh, 9 months, well, the last year, 9 months of the last year, my grandmother was pregnant with my father. She didn't get it because she was on the farm. They were healthy. They did just fine. He was born. 3 months later, the pandemic was over. So from conception to 3 months old, he lived through that pandemic along with my grandparents. Well, a lot of people's families didn't. A lot of children were lost. A lot of pregnancies were lost. It was a very difficult time, but people didn't know what to do. They didn't have the National Health, the World Health Organization, CDC. They didn't have all this stuff in place that could tell you what to do and when to do it to stop the spread. All they could do was sit at home and wait till somebody got sick and try to nurse them. That's all. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot. And America, for one, and I know Europe was still recovering from World War One. They didn't have much infrastructure, I don't think. I didn't live there. I can only read the books and study history. So it was difficult everywhere. People just didn't know what to do. Well, after 1920 and the pandemic was officially over, people said, okay, now we can start rebuilding. And since we had the war to end all wars, we don't have to worry about war again. We know about this flu. They're working on inoculations. Everything was fine. Well, it was fine for 9 years. Yep, 9 years later, they had a little thing called, in 1929, the stock market crash in the U.S., and it was a worldwide depression. Like they weren't depressed enough for World War One and the pandemic. So the depression hit. Now there was broad, widespread unemployment. Uh, People were standing in lines in America. I assume they were doing the same in Europe. I heard, again, this is anecdotally from someone, that in Germany during the Depression, if you had a wheelbarrow full of money, you couldn't afford a loaf of bread. Inflation and all that, that's kind of what happened. Happened the same way here in the U.S. Uh, Again, those, our parents, our grandparents, our great grandparents still working through this stuff, and they were struggling. My farmer grandparents, like farmer grandparents everywhere, you think would be doing okay because they could raise their own food. Well, they could. They did raise their own food, But economically, they didn't do well because they couldn't sell the food. There was no one with money to buy it, and literally, crops were going to waste. Well, at the last 2 years of this depression, then in the U.S. and I think central part of Canada as well, they had the big Dust Bowl thing going on. Well, why did they have a Dust Bowl? Again, in those days, it was ignorance. They didn't know how to farm properly. They knew how to grow stuff. You go plow it, you plant it, you water it, you raise it, you harvest it. Great. But that didn't mean it was sustainable because of the way they were ruining the land. They just didn't know. It was ignorance. Nowadays, they know better. So anyway, the big Dust Bowl set in. It destroyed farming. Farmers lost their farms. Uh, they had to go find work somewhere. They 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 had these old Model Ts. You know, right after the pandemic was over and after World War One was over, people were buying Model Ts. They were modernizing. Well, all of a sudden, they found themselves pulling their engines out, pulling their drivetrains out, taking the front end off their flivvers, and hooking it up to that team of horses that they still had grazing out there in the field. Uh, in America, they were called Hoover buggies. Correct me if anybody out there knows. I'm not looking this stuff on Wiki. I don't care. It's a lot of it's anecdotal. It's just from what I learned from family and friends. And in Canada, they had maybe it was Bennett buggies in Canada and Hoover mobiles in the U.S. Anyway, horses were pulling these things around. People couldn't afford any other way to do it. Uh, and literally, food was becoming scarce. There was a shortage of food everywhere. Food was rotting in the fields or being harvested and rotting on the loading docks. Nobody to buy it. Farmers were literally burning their fields because they couldn't afford to raise it. Literally, it was costing more to take it to market than they were going to make off of it by a huge amount. So times were tough. Well, then the depression was over. Now, in the war and the pandemic, there was a death toll. 90 million people plus or minus, and these are off the top of my head. 90 to 100 million people in just those two events. Well, would you believe there was something to the order of 10 million that died during the Depression of starvation and suicide? I mean, it's like it was tough during getting through World War One. It was tough getting through the pandemic. Then you suddenly had a few years of prosperity, and all of a sudden it was gone. Some people couldn't take it. They lost their fortunes. They just didn't want to go through another horrible disaster. So they committed suicide. They just didn't understand things will get better. They get bad, they get better. There's this big wave. So anyway, roughly another 10 million died during the Depression. Well, things were okay then. 1933, it was over. People began to get jobs. They began to have some small amount of prosperity. It was slow growth, but they made it, and they were coming back. And then, if you remember, I said right at the end of the pandemic, my father was born. Well, he got greeted in 1939 uh, with another war. This one was called World War II. That's when World War One became World War One instead of the Great War, because now you had two of them. Uh, and all those young men born after World War One, when their fathers came home, they were going in the military and going to fight a war. So all of a sudden the world gets turned upside down, and you just came off the Depression. They were probably already a little bit familiar with what to do. Rationing was put in place. Recycling. Today, recycle. Oh my God, we got to recycle. Hey, recycling in World War II was a huge thing. And it got right down to, if you were going down the road and you saw a piece of sheet metal that blown off the top of somebody's barn, you picked it up. You either took it and you recycled it for the war effort, or you put it on your hen house because you had a victory garden and a hen house for your eggs and your chickens. That was just the way of life. People did what they had to do to get by. So even though we had all these young men going to Europe to go to war from North America and from Australia and other places, um, and all over Europe, Europe getting torn up again, getting blown up, fields getting blown up, farms getting bombed out. It was just a difficult time for everybody. And at the end of it, 75 million more people lost. Civilians, war participants on both sides, uh, just the total loss. 75 million. So now you're approaching 200 million. You're 1.75 million, or yeah, 175 to 200 million people dead. I think my brain's getting a little confused, but I remember round numbers. I don't remember details. So you can check on Wiki if you want to. So that went till 1945. Then you had the next bit of horrible history. All these soldiers came home. Now, I don't know if it happened in Europe. I haven't checked. I don't know if it happened in England. Probably did. Human nature is human nature, but the next big disaster, babies. Oh my God. Starting in 1945, the number of babies started to skyrocket. 1946, skyrocket. 1947, it peaked out. The largest number of babies born, I know, in the history of the United States. And then it came down for another few years and started up again. Now, when it started up again and reached those 1947 levels, everybody called these babies boomers. You still hear about boomers. Well, but those of us in that first hump, we were called war babies. Now, I think later they joined us with the boomers because it sounded a little negative, a little not so politically correct, or at least politically poor, to call all this generation of babies war babies uh, and hang that war thing over our head. We weren't in it, we were a result of it. So we had all these war babies come along. And they went, all of a sudden you had the 50s, this fantastic time of boom when everybody was prospering. There was nothing really going. Oh, wait a minute, I forgot to mention 1953, Korea. The Korean War was going on. Uh, America was involved in that, but it wasn't a war. It was a police action. It's never been called a war. It was just a police action. And who was in this police action? Well, all those young men, the ones born after World War One, our parents, my parents, they went back to war in Korea, and their younger brothers and sisters, or younger brothers in those days, and some sisters as nurses. There were actually quite a few women in all the wars, more than they get credit for. But they went back to war in Korea in the Korean War. My father was in through the Korean. He was in for 35 years, so he was in through most of this, right through Vietnam. Though he didn't go to Vietnam, he was in the reserves by then. He did 17 years active, and the rest of his 35 he did as a reservist. But he he was involved in it, and let's face it, what do war babies do? Well, the war babies spent a few years without some of their fathers around, uh, or rarely seeing them. In the case of the Navy, it was we did get to see them periodically. Uh, but it was a difficult time. But still, we were going through the '60s, thinking things were great and economies were moving up and things were doing well. Uh, I'm going to guess at this. I remember there weren't nearly as many lives lost total in the Korean War. I'm thinking it was half as much. I'm thinking it's around 5 million. I just penciled it in down here in my memory book. I use this because this one is defective. And if I get through editing this, if I put this into editor and there's no sound on it, well, let's put it this way: if you're watching it, there was sound on it. All right. So anyway, that went on from 50 to 53. Now we had a chance to really get into a time of peace. All right. But in 1955, there was a little thing called the Great Indochina War. No, the Second Indochina War, not the Indochina War. I think it was the second one. I don't remember exactly because most of us refer to it as the Vietnam War. Now, America wasn't involved in it heavily then, uh, but the French were. This was had French involved, China involved, most of the Asian countries involved. I suspect Australia was involved. They're an Asian country. They're in the Ring of Fire. New Zealanders. Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure what the involvement was, but I know it was going on, and it was building. And I remember going through high school and studying history and social studies and things they don't teach anymore. Um, this thing was growing, and my friends and I, we were saying, you know, by the time we get out of high school, we may end up having to go to war. My father had, his father had, his father actually did it on horseback. Yeah, that was when a cavalry didn't have treads on; they had hooves. So anyway, our eye was on it, and then the saber rattling started with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nobody could settle down. Everybody was constantly nervous and worried. My uncle, who was lieutenant colonel in the army, he built a house and had a bomb shelter put in. All of us war babies, who were now boomers, uh, we had to go through constant drills where, well, sirens would go off in town. We'd crawl under our desks and cower down there. We'd run down to a bomb shelter that was always supplied with civil defense food and water and that kind of thing. Things were not totally without events. But then it happened. In 1965, we had had a presence in Asia, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. It had been growing. Our involvement had been growing. Well, what the hell? Remember all those babies born called war babies? Well, we suddenly got preference, and we were getting drafted by the thousand. Uh, I was raised to believe you had three choices when you got out of high school. Just three. Life was simple. You got a job, you went in the military, or you went to college. Well, college was priced a lot of people out. Uh, the military, not everybody's military bound. I mean, military careers, especially, take a certain kind of people because it's a difficult life. Uh, so getting a job was the way to go. But, you know, my generation, the war babies couldn't get jobs. If you were 2S on your draft card, you couldn't get a job. Why would I hire someone who's going to get drafted tomorrow and I'll lose them? So getting jobs was difficult. I wanted to go to college, desperately wanted to go to college, and I did. I graduated from high school, and the next day, well, the next week, I started. And I went to summer school for 3 months, took my first three courses, did well, decided this was what I wanted to do, but we couldn't afford it. So I figured I'm going in the Navy, I'm going to get GI Bill. So I joined. I didn't get drafted. I didn't want to get drafted. I joined. So I ended up, you know, kind of having the day saved, so to speak. Well, Vietnam went on, believe it or not, from 55 to 75. Our involvement in it was about 10 years. And you had about 1,350,000. You might want to check that. Total deaths, not just American deaths. I think we had 50,000. I don't know. I'd have to go look it up myself. Or 50, yeah, we had about 50,000. But so there was 1,353,000. Well, this just, I don't know how accurate that number is. And I don't even, that might have been 5,353,000. I don't remember for sure. But it was a lot of people that died from that. Uh, and after that, 75, boy, we were going to have it made. Everybody gets to prosper, everything gets to grow, everything gets to settle down. But then the saber rattling in the Middle East started. Uh, the hostage crisis in Iran in '79. It went on for a couple of years. The You had Gaddafi saber rattling. You had all this stuff going on in the Middle East. And then all of a sudden in 90, yeah, it was 90, 9091, Desert Storm happened. There was another 370, 380,000 people die in that. All sides, civilians, military. And again, I don't know how they get these numbers accurate anyway, but those are numbers that I remember hearing. Because I was in Desert Storm. After Desert Storm, I retired. Uh, but it didn't end there. 2003, 2011, the Iraq War, and actually in 2001, Enduring Freedom started, and it has lasted to today with Freedom Sentinel. I don't know how many people are lost so far. I don't I don't know when you'd ever see a number or how they would keep a number for that. So we've had a pretty horrible history for the past 106 years. A lot of deaths. Now, why did I bring all that up? Well, you know what? We're going through a tough time right now. Uh, the coronavirus is pretty bad. Have you heard any numbers like the numbers that I talked about in any of that? Uh, so far, they're not nearly so bad. Why? We're smarter, we're better educated. The governments are educating us. CDC, the World Health Organization, we're constantly being educated on what to do. We don't have to sit around and wait till our neighbor gets sick to say, oh, this might be dangerous. We see it every day. We've got the communication system. They didn't have, all they had was radio. And they didn't have, the average person, at least in the U.S., didn't have but maybe a handful of channels to listen to on the radio. And a lot of those had static. Uh, and then, you know, the knowledge of the H1N1 virus was very limited. Most of what we know now has been learned since the pandemic, I think. And now we've got H2N4s and all kinds of other varieties of it. I've had two of the big ones. I had Hong Kong flu and I had swine flu. If in my current physical condition I got either one of those again, it could easily kill me. I thought I was going to die then. I was delirious through one of them. I don't remember which one it was, but I was totally delirious. I didn't even know, I couldn't hold my head up. So, and it was an H1N1. I remember that. But at any rate, we know what to do now. So we got all the people that are guessing. That's us, everyday people. Because we get 24-hour news and we get station after station of 24-hour news. And when this thing started out, we were getting horrible news. In America, we're about to have a presidential election, so everybody got involved in politicizing a potential epidemic. Everybody blaming everybody else, all kind of conspiracy theories. Well, the average person sitting out here, they started. We've got friends who were so horrified they were ready to go to the basement and cower down in the corner and try to survive this thing because they figured if the country didn't know what to do, if the government didn't know what to do, if they said we weren't ready because one side's saying they weren't ready, the other side's saying the other side wasn't ready, everybody's saying all this stuff. I didn't worry about it because I've been first responder on a contract that the company I worked for had, and I've spent months and months and months on emergency situations. Plus, I grew up with getting a bunch of hurricanes under my belt, tornadoes under my belt, floods under my belt, uh, all kinds of disasters. Um, and I have learned that every single state, 50 states, have 50 full organizations for emergency response. And they're experienced. Don't think they're not experienced. They may not have been experienced in a pandemic, influenza pandemic, but they were experienced because every state has had some kind of disaster, be it mudslides, forest fires, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, you name it. There has been some kind of disaster, and they respond very well. Uh, and everyone always complains that the government's not responding fast enough. Well, the state governments do. They're out there right away. So I figured they were doing things that politicians, they're not doctors, they're not research biologists, they don't know anything about this stuff. They have to listen to advisors, and their advisors are saying, hey, you can use this against the other side. And so people got nervous. Well, when it finally hit home with the government that all the governments, I think, everywhere, that this is really going to be bad, uh, they kind of settled down and took care of business. But a lot of it was already being taken care of by the CDC and WHO. So those are the people I put my faith in. They're the ones who know what they're doing anyway. And nobody knows what they're doing in an influenza epidemic. Nobody. Because it's new, it's a mutated version of something, or it's something that came from somewhere that they weren't even aware of. Some of these flu viruses, a lot of them come from fowl. The swine flu came from pigs. They have some of them that come from snakes. They're literally, you don't know where they come from, and they're slightly different. And the bad ones, like in a pandemic, mutate during the course of the pandemic. So the rules change there. They have to learn how is it spread because they're not all spread the same way. Well, who's going to get us through this? Well, I know who's going to get us through it. We're going to get us through it. That's who got us through all of this horrible history. Our great grandparents, our grandparents, our parents, everything that we have done, we've gotten through this because we've made the sacrifices. We've done what we have to do. Now, there's one lieutenant governor in the U.S. out in Texas that has said, the elderly people should sacrifice themselves for the economic regrowth after this is over. Now, did I mention that the war babies born after World War II were the ones given draft preference when they turned 18? Well, guess who they're talking about now? Same group, the war babies, the peak. We're in the 70s now. Our health is poor. Well, this guy was a complete nut. I hope he gets voted out of office. But I'll make a deal with anyone in government who thinks that we should sacrifice. If every elected official, state, federal, local, 65 or older, will get together in a stadium somewhere to drink the Kool-Aid, I'll be right behind them. At a safe social distance, dressed out in biohazard gear, with a jar of hand cleaner in one hand and a roll of toilet paper in the other, waving by. Well, that's as silly as what the lieutenant governor said. We simply work together. And what I've seen so far among the people and what I see on YouTube among everybody that puts out videos on YouTube, everywhere all over the world, the people are doing what's necessary to keep this from spreading, while the governments make their decisions on what's politically correct and fight among themselves about the right timing and oh my God, the economy's going to hell in a handbasket. Well, it is. I wonder if they're concerned as much about our economy as they are about the fact that if you're not working, you're not paying taxes, so that's their economy. Just saying, I don't know. Anyway, I thought I'd just throw this out there. It's food for thought, just to let everybody know we're not in any worse time right now, and I don't believe as bad a time as times past. In the past 106 years, the destruction and the deaths far outshadowed what we're going through right now. So I don't think we need any knee jerk reaction to anything. I think we need to do exactly what we're doing. Everybody take care of themselves. Linda's made, I don't know, 40 or 50 face masks and given them to family and friends and people who are putting them together for people who can't get out very easily. Uh, you can't buy them, so all the women who sew around here are sewing them and giving them away for free. Uh, it's just people do that in emergencies. People do that. Good people do. We've had one person here in Tennessee uh, go on eBay and start selling toilet paper early on, very early on, at a high price and had all kinds of stuff listed that people needed. Well, he'd gone out and just filled up his truck full of it. Well, I think it was eBay, and I think if I heard correctly, eBay said, nope, you're not going to do this, and kicked him off eBay. So he was giving it away because he couldn't sell it. So there are always opportunists. We can't focus on them. We focus on the people who are sitting around doing what's necessary. If I come across more toilet paper than we need, we've got friends who have told us they haven't been able to get any. We take it to them. We take them bread. We take them food. We've got friends who have cancer. We've got a lot of older friends that just can't get out and do the running around, and it's too high a risk, even higher risk than for me. And with cardiovascular disease, it's 73 years old. I'm right there, folks. What can I say? So anyway, thought I'd just put this out, let everybody hear me ramble, and probably turn this off. It'll probably have the least views of any video I've ever done, and I may lose subscribers over it. But you know what? That's life. So I'll leave you with this. I wish you all a healthy and long life. Definitely a happy life. And when your time does come to leave this earth, I hope that you're buried in a box made of 100-year-old wood that comes from a tree that I'm going to plant for you tomorrow. So keep that in mind. You have a good one. This is Solomon. I'm saying I'm out of here. Bye.